Have you ever seen a man lose his mind because of a knot of hair? That was the first thing Thomas said when I met him. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't mad either, at least not in the way you'd expect. His voice was too steady for madness, too cold. I was a journalist then, chasing local legends and superstitions for a documentary project. I never imagined this one would be the last I'd work on. It started with a house. An old, lopsided thing just beyond the edge of Mardin, where the land turns dusty and the wind feels like it's been cursed for centuries. A woman named Zara had once lived there. Rumors claimed she was a healer. Others whispered she was a witch. When she died, no one attended her burial. They say she buried herself face down, hands clenched around something no one dared to uncover. Thomas moved into the house 3 years after her death. He bought it cheaply, charmed by its mystery and solitude. I should have known something was wrong the moment I stepped in, he told me. There were feathers in the corners of every room, tied with black string. The floor creaked, not like wood, but like breath. Something in the walls made clicking sounds at night, like someone slowly fingering a comb. And then there was the mirror in the bedroom, tall, gilded, and cracked like ice. It wasn't the reflection that haunted him, but what wasn't reflected. Sometimes, he said, I'd lift my arm, and my reflection wouldn't, or I'd see someone pass behind me, but the room would be empty. The first real sign came 6 weeks after moving in. One morning, Thomas found a bundle of hair at the foot of his bed. Coarse, long, and knotted, wrapped around a small bone that looked disturbingly human. He threw it out, thinking it was some animal's remains. But the next morning, it was back, neater, tighter. This time, it was soaked in something thick and black. Neighbors started avoiding him. Children threw stones at his gate and screamed words in a dialect Thomas couldn't recognize. An old man spat at his feet one afternoon and muttered, "You've awakened her hunger." That night, the walls began whispering. He swore they were calling him by name, drawing him toward the cellar. The cellar was locked with rusted chains when he first moved in. He hadn't dared to cut them, but after 2 weeks of the voices, he gave in. Inside, there was a circle painted on the floor in blood-red pigment that hadn't faded. At the center, nothing. But around the circle were dozens of knots. Hair, string, even sinew. All of them pointed inward. He stepped inside the circle. He doesn't know why. Maybe it was the whisper that said, "She needs your breath." When he did, the door slammed shut, and the chains locked themselves. The lights went out. Thomas screamed until he blacked out. He woke up outside, naked. The words, "Zara's thread is tied," carved into the skin of his back. The change was slow, but irreversible. At first, he couldn't sleep. Then he couldn't dream. When he finally did, it was always of Zara's house. Only older, crawling with insects, filled with laughter that belonged to no one alive. Then came the hallucinations. He saw Zara in the mirror, in puddles, even in the eyes of strangers. Her mouth never moved, but he could hear her spells behind his ribs. He tried burning the house. The flames swallowed the walls but left the mirror untouched. The knots, the cellar, the whispers, all returned the next day, untouched, as if nothing had ever been done. "It's not a house anymore," he told me. "It's a vessel." Desperate, Thomas tried to find anyone who could undo what had been done. He found a man in Diyarbakir, blind, mute, but known to unbind. The man didn't speak, only touched Thomas's chest and nodded gravely. He gave him a small pouch and a warning. Do not open this. Bury it where the wind has never blown. But Thomas couldn't resist. That night, he opened the pouch. Inside was a piece of knotted hair, coiled like a question. The moment he touched it, he felt her breath on his neck. That night, he awoke with black thread sewn across his mouth, his hands tied to the bed. He swore he hadn't done it himself. He began to rot while still alive. Doctors called it necrosis, but it spread in patterns, circular, deliberate, like a map. One day, his shadow separated from him in full daylight. It ran across the floor and vanished into the wall. That was the first time he cried. You can't fight a curse woven from breath, he said. It lives inside you. I asked him why he stayed. Why not leave the house? It doesn't matter where I go, he answered. She tied the thread to me. Wherever I sleep, the knots appear again. You can't run from what breathes through your bones. I left him that night, shaken but skeptical, until I reviewed my camera footage. In every frame where Thomas spoke of the knot, a dark shape hovered behind him, never moving, never clear, just watching. Worse, in one still, I saw myself, my reflection, but I was smiling. I wasn't smiling when the shot was taken. I tried to contact Thomas the next day. The house was gone, not burned, not collapsed, gone, as if it had never existed. The plot was just dust, the neighbours silent, eyes downcast. But I still hear the clicking at night, the sound of something weaving, winding, whispering. Weeks passed, my sleep shattered. I began finding small knots of hair under my pillow. I live in Istanbul. I live alone. I've moved 3 times. They always return. Sometimes they hum when I touch them. Once, I found one tied around my cat's tail. She hasn't been the same since. Eyes always fixed on the same corner of the ceiling. The final blow came when I found my reflection moving a second too slow, like it was thinking before mimicking me. That's when I heard Zera's name in my own voice. I hadn't spoken it. So I'm telling you now, not for a story, not for attention, but to pass the thread. Because that's how it works, I think. The curse is a stitch passed from mouth to ear, from story to listener. If you're hearing this, be careful what you see in mirrors. Be careful with what you find beneath your pillow. And above all, never untie the knot. Never. The first time Jonathan heard the name Elira Mallory, it was muttered by an elderly woman outside an antique store in the old district of Greystone. Jonathan, a British folklore researcher in his mid-40s, was travelling through the countryside, documenting forgotten craft rituals. The woman had been sitting on a wooden crate, stringing beads into what looked like an old talisman, when she stopped mid-motion, stared into his eyes, and whispered the name with trembling lips. Her voice was low, urgent, like a warning. Then she stood and disappeared into the narrow alley behind the store. Something about the way she had said that name lodged deep in Jonathan's mind. That night, back in his inn, he couldn't sleep. He looked up the name, but all he found were scattered mentions of an obscure weaver from the late 1800s. No photo, no birth record, no confirmed death. Just whispers in forums, a few translated village journals, and one disturbing thread on a regional folklore blog. She wove spells into fabric. Whoever wore them went mad, or worse. The following morning, Curiosity became obsession. Jonathan returned to the shop, a dusty little place filled with faded quilts, tarnished silver, and the scent of smoke-dried wood. He asked the shopkeeper about Elira Mallory, but the man stiffened and only said, "We don't speak her name here." Jonathan noticed a locked glass case behind the counter and asked what was inside. The man, hesitant, finally unlocked it, revealing a bundle of folded cloth, black, deep as coal, with gold threads woven in cryptic patterns. "One of hers," he muttered. "I keep it only because I can't throw it away." Jonathan offered to take it, and the shopkeeper looked at him with something between pity and fear. "You don't buy such things. You take them, and they take from you." Back in his inn, Jonathan unfolded the fabric on the bed. It was heavier than expected, and the patterns almost seemed to shift under the light. He photographed it, planning to send it to a colleague in London, but his phone refused to turn on. His laptop too suddenly shut down. Then a sharp static filled the room's air. The lights flickered. Jonathan felt cold, as though something had brushed against his spine. He turned fast. Nothing there, just the cloth now lying on the floor, though he was sure he hadn't moved it. Trying to shake the unease, he folded it back and placed it in his suitcase. That night, he dreamed of a woman in an old-fashioned headscarf seated at a loom, her fingers moving unnaturally fast. Her eyes never blinked. She weaved and weaved, mumbling in a language he didn't understand. When she looked up, her face was not human, and she smiled. Over the next few days, things got worse. Every mirror in the inn began to warp his reflection. He would turn, expecting to see someone behind him, but there was no one. One night, he woke to find the fabric unfolded again, lying across his chest. He hadn't touched it. He knew he hadn't. Then came the voices, soft whispers in a foreign tongue, sometimes just laughter, always when the lights went out. He checked out and moved to a different inn in a nearby town, but the phenomena followed him. The cloth stayed in his suitcase and every attempt to get rid of it failed. He left it in a cab. It reappeared on his bed. He tried burning it. Flames wouldn't touch it. Once he threw it into the Hollow Stream River from Westbridge Crossing, only to return to his room and find it hanging from the closet door. Desperate, Jonathan tracked down a local folklorist, Professor Bernard Locke, who lived in the northern borough of Millhurst. When Jonathan laid out the cloth on Bernard's desk, the old man went pale. "You should never have brought this here," he whispered. He poured salt around the fabric in a circle and lit incense. He explained that Elira Mallory was a rumoured thread witch, a woman who stitched curses into garments. Not just madness, but anchors for spirits. Gateways. Jonathan demanded how to undo it. Bernard sighed and said, "There's no undoing, only returning." The only way to stop the curse was to bring the cloth back to where it was last woven, an abandoned bathhouse in the village of Eld Hollow, where Elira was last seen. But Jonathan had to go alone, and he had to go before the next full moon. Eld Hollow was colder than expected, and the bathhouse stood like a forgotten wound in the heart of the village. Its windows were bricked up, the doors chained. Yet something called to him. Jonathan broke the chains with a rusted crowbar and stepped into the darkness. His flashlight flickered. The walls were covered in rotted tapestries. In the center room, the marble floor had a familiar pattern, almost identical to the one in the cursed cloth. He spread the fabric across the floor. As soon as it touched the marble, the air grew thick. Voices rose, unintelligible at first, then clearer, pleading, crying, begging in dozens of voices. The fabric began to unravel on its own, threads pulling apart and twisting into shapes, Faces, hands, eyes. One voice, unmistakably Elira's, hissed from the shadows. "You wore the gate." The ground trembled. The air turned icy. Shadows poured out from the walls like smoke, crawling toward the cloth. Jonathan wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His heart pounded as if it were being pulled by invisible hands. The cloth lifted from the floor and wrapped itself around him, tightly, violently. He screamed, but it muffled his voice like a thick veil. When he awoke, it was dawn. The bathhouse was empty and the cloth was gone. He checked his body. No marks, no wounds, just a small stitch on his chest, perfectly sewn in gold thread. He returned to Greystone, shaken but alive. For a while, the nightmares stopped. The whispers faded, but not entirely. Back home in London, Jonathan tried to move on. He lectured again, travelled less, but every now and then he would catch a glimpse of her, in a reflection, in a museum glass, or the stitching of a stranger's coat. One day, a student handed him a scarf from an estate in the Midlands, asking for help dating the embroidery. Jonathan froze. It was the same thread. His hands trembled as he held it. The fabric pulsed. He quickly wrapped it in plastic and stored it deep in the university archive. But he knew it wasn't over. Something had followed him. Something didn't want to be forgotten. Soon after, he began losing time. Hours vanished. He'd find himself in places he didn't remember going. One night he woke up with thread clippings in his hands and needle marks in his fingers. There were new tapestries pinned to his walls, ones he hadn't made. Each showed a figure with gold thread eyes, watching. He stopped going to work, boarded up his windows, but the whispers returned, louder than before. One word kept repeating, woven, woven. It wasn't just the cloth anymore, it was in him. Jonathan hasn't been seen in over a year. His flat was found abandoned, every surface covered in cloth. Walls, ceilings, even the floor. Each piece bore the same pattern, a spiral made of tiny gold thread eyes. Authorities declared him missing, but some say, on certain nights, if you walk past the university archives, you'll hear the faint sound of a loom, and if you listen closely, beneath the rhythmic clicking of the shuttle, there's a voice, a woman's voice, still weaving. It started with a simple letter, yellowed at the edges and sealed with a cracked wax crest. Michael found it wedged inside the frame of the attic mirror, behind a loose plank he was replacing. The house he and his wife had just moved into, nestled at the end of Ashgrove Lane, had belonged to her late aunt, an eccentric woman no one had seen for the last decade. They inherited it under strange circumstances, and despite the place's eerie aura, it was too valuable to refuse. Michael frowned as he unfolded the brittle parchment. The handwriting was jagged, like it had been scratched onto the paper. He read aloud, almost mockingly. Do not reflect. Do not repeat. Do not read aloud. For the spoken binds, and the mirror feeds. He scoffed, tossing the letter aside. Someone had a flair for drama, he muttered. But that night, something in the mirror flickered. His wife, Evelyn, had felt uneasy from the beginning. The air inside the house always seemed heavier in the attic. She would avoid it entirely, especially after the mirror started fogging on its own. Michael dismissed it as old glass and bad insulation, but Evelyn wasn't so sure. One evening, while sorting boxes in the attic, Michael noticed his reflection linger just a second too long after he moved. It mimicked him, delayed. He blinked, stared. The mirror blinked back. He leaned in closer, heart thudding. For a split second, he saw something behind his reflection, a black figure, tall and still. When he turned around, the attic was empty. That night, Michael woke up choking. His hands clutched his throat as if something invisible was pressing down. Evelyn screamed, snapping him awake. "Your eyes!" she cried. "They were rolled back." He sat up, gasping. "It was just a nightmare," he whispered. But deep inside, he felt something had touched him. The next morning, the mirror in the attic was shattered, but not on the floor. The shards were still in place, held together by something unseen. The reflection still worked, albeit fractured. And in each shard, Michael could see himself, but in different positions. In some, he was smiling. In others, he was watching himself sleep. Evelyn insisted on getting rid of the mirror, but every time Michael tried, it was back in the attic the next day, whole again. He even buried it in the woods behind the house once. The next morning, it was hanging back on the attic wall. He tried burning the letter that came with it, but the flames wouldn't catch, not even with lighter fluid. And the attic, once only creepy, had now turned menacing. The wallpaper peeled in strange symbols. Evelyn began hearing whispers whenever she stood too close to the mirror. Once, she swore it whispered her name. Desperate, they invited a local historian who knew the house's background. The man turned pale as soon as he stepped into the attic. "This mirror doesn't reflect," he muttered. "It remembers." He showed them old sketches, one of them dated 1872, depicting a mirror with identical carvings. Beneath it, a Latin phrase, speculum maledictum. He explained the mirror was part of an old ritual crafted by a cult that believed reflections were the doorways to the soul. Speaking aloud in front of the mirror, especially the incantation in the letter, was said to activate a binding curse. "Someone did this," he said grimly, "and now it knows you." Michael started recording himself while sleeping. What he saw on the footage chilled him. He would sit up between 3:12 and 3:17 a.m. every night, whispering words in a guttural, unfamiliar voice. The same words from the letter. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim camera light, reflecting something that wasn't just physical. Worse, Evelyn woke with scratches down her back, as if something with long fingers had dragged itself along her spine. Michael denied any involvement, but Evelyn was beginning to question his sanity and her own. That day, she checked into a hotel, alone. Michael tried to destroy the mirror one last time. He smashed it with a sledgehammer, shattered it into hundreds of shards. This time, he buried each piece in different locations, some even thrown into the river. But that night, he heard scratching, dozens of faint clawing noises in the attic. When he went up, his knees nearly gave out. The mirror was back, whole. It now showed not just him, but Evelyn, asleep in her hotel room. A dark silhouette stood beside her, unmoving. He drove through the night to her hotel, heart pounding, breaking every speed limit. He burst into her room and found her unharmed, but her eyes were locked on the wall-length mirror. "I can't move," she whispered. "It's inside." Michael smashed the mirror with a chair. Evelyn screamed, not in pain, but as if something tore away from her. The mirror's glass turned black and cracked inward like a whirlpool. And from within, a voice hissed, "Do not reflect, do not repeat, do not read aloud." They left the house the next day, sold it for nothing, never looked back, but they could never explain why. No matter where they went, a mirror would always appear. In hotel rooms, rental apartments, even in a restaurant's bathroom. Each one somehow familiar. Michael began to avoid mirrors completely. He covered them at home, shaved blindly, but sometimes, just sometimes, he would catch a glimpse and see not his own eyes, but something watching from behind them. Evelyn, too, stopped sleeping deeply. The dreams came back, always at 3:12. Months later, Michael received another letter. No return address. It was the same parchment, same cracked seal. This time, it read only one line: "You spoke, now we watch." He didn't show it to Evelyn. He burned it, or tried to. It didn't catch fire. It never would. And in the reflection of the window beside him, his own smile slowly faded, while the reflections did not.